Welcome everybody to the Genial Compliance webinar on an introduction to effective risk management through risk matrices in iPassport. My name's Craig Bunn and I'm the VP of Product Strategy and Quality over here at Genial Compliance. And joining me today are my colleagues Claire and Bob, who will be monitoring the chat and conversation for us. So if you do have anything you'd like to share with us, please do drop it in the chat and they'll be able to pass that on. Okay, so we're just going to get going now into our webinar here. So an official welcome to everybody. And what are we talking about today? Well, we're going to be looking at risk management, and specifically risk management through a risk matrix and how iPassport can help with this. We'll be looking at what a risk matrix is, how they're created and how they relate to a risk appetite. And we'll be taking a look at how they can be created in the iPassport risk management tool as well. So the aim of this tool is to help reduce the administrative burden that is associated with risk assessments while maintaining the level of complexity required for the situation or the risk assessment in general. But first, before we do that, we're just going to take a very short look at what we do at Genial Compliance. So if any of you are unfamiliar with our product iPassport, we'll have a couple of slides and then we'll get back into the risk assessment for you. So iPassport is a SaaS-based quality management system. So you can access it from any device that's internet enabled and you do not need additional IT support for this. We started out in NHS laboratories, so pathology and genetics. We've mostly focused around the ISO standards. So for example, 15189, 17025, 13485 as well as the CAP-based ones. And the integration of CAP into iPassport as well. We're also used for things such as 9001 and 27001. So the system is very flexible. We are used for document control, compliance management, audit management, non-conformity management, asset management, training management and competency management by more than 218 organizations globally. And that represents more than 50,000 users actively using iPassport. So you can see our spread here on the short slide here from the UK over to East and West Coast America all the way down to Australasia and everywhere in between. What we're looking at today is the risk management tool that actually joins onto iPassport here. So we're just going to get back into that for you now. So why do risk assessments at all? Well, the purpose is not simply to generate mountains of, in this instance, digital paperwork, although it may seem that way to lots of people. Nor should it be just about getting certification. So it's the end goal. We just need to do the risk assessment so we can get that certification. Although, of course, risk assessments are required under some certification and accreditation schemes. Each environment, project, organization, they're all unique. So they require their own risk assessment. It's absolutely fine to share, say, a template or the outline structure of a risk assessment. But as each of these things are unique, the risk assessment needs to be unique and applied to that particular thing. So we do need to continually do this. And there's sort of an ethical duty on us to actually make whatever we're doing, whether it be a project, a medical device, our organization, a working environment, as safe as possible. And it helps to establish a proactive culture of improvement, and especially risk improvement. So the more everybody sees us doing risk assessments, the more people become involved in these, and generally the safer things become as well. Now, if we look at what the ISO definition of risk is, this is from 31,000, the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Now, we're not going to change that uncertainty into certainty, but we can mitigate against that uncertainty on those objectives. So we need to identify them. That's the key thing, identify those risks. Write it down, because we're all doing risk assessments on a daily basis, but we don't necessarily have the evidence to support this. So we need to write it down. We've got it recorded, and it also acts as reference material for other people so they can see the thought process has gone into that risk assessment. We then assess those risks and treat them as required and monitor. So this falls into that typical plan, do, check, act cycle. We want to continually assess our risk assessments. Very rarely are they a standalone thing. We might create a baseline risk assessment which we can work from, but they should all be reviewed and we should be trying to reduce that risk further and further. What is a risk matrix and why is it going to be useful for this risk assessment? Well, risk matrix is one of the most widely used tools for evaluating risk. You may also have heard it called a risk heat map, and if you've seen a picture of the matrix, you'll get an idea as to why. It was first used back in 1978 by the US Air Force, and that process has been evolving since then, and it entered into widespread mainstream use around 1995. And I'm sure we've all seen a risk matrix and had experience of them. It uses a combination of scale of probability of occurrence and scale of a severity of the effects. The matrix itself has loads of synonyms. This is based on industry sector, so we're using probability and severity. You'll also see as common use, likelihood, consequences, and many other examples. So whatever tool you're using, whatever template you're using, it's important that it is configurable for the actual risk assessment being carried out, because each industry sector, each department even, can use different terminology here. So why are they so popular? Well, they're relatively easy to use and apply, and non-experts can pick them up quite quickly, which means we can start getting into that risk-based thinking quite early on without having to have dedicated risk managers involved here. They're easy to interpret. Anybody can look at a risk matrix and see where that risk has come from, and that helps fuel that risk conversation. Because it's so easy to interpret, people can see these, they can accept it, they can think about it, they can challenge it, and it can start that risk conversation there, which is a wonderful thing. At the basic level, they do not require detailed analysis. Now, that's not to say they don't require any analysis, they certainly do. We do need to think about that risk, but they don't require as much detailed analysis as some other tools, such as an FMEA, for example. And the important thing is they can be used in different risk assessments and processes here. So one of the important things here is a risk scenario analysis. Well, for different scenarios, we need to do a risk assessment, yes, but to show we've thought about these risks, we can use the risk matrix in that scenario analysis. So we don't have to hunt for different tools just because the overall assessment is called something different. So what does a risk matrix look like? Well, below we can see a couple of examples that we've got from iPassport that we've configured. And here you'll be able to see a 3x3 grid at the top and a 5x5 grid at the bottom. There are lots of different combinations of these. So typically you'll see 3x3, 4x4, 5x4, 5x5, 5x7 are all examples of a risk matrix that you might see in common use. The greater those numbers, the greater the granularity and ultimately the clarity of the results you can get from this. So using that risk matrix, those values, that risk matrix structure is all well and good. How do we find out what a risk is on that? Well, we look at our 5x5 matrix and we'll see there's probability and severity. So in our probability, we have our 5, which is improbable, unlikely, occasional, likely, and frequent. And each of one of those is given a numerical value. We have the same for severity, negligible, minor, moderate, significant, catastrophic. Each of those is given a numerical value. And to find out how the risk is applied, we simply multiply the probability by the severity and we get a risk score. And it's that simple. With it being so simple, we should be able to pick it up and use it straight away. But there are a few notes of caution just while we're doing this. So these are things to be aware of. And if you're aware of them, then you can actually mitigate against them. It's not that you shouldn't use a risk matrix because of these notes, but you should be aware of them to help use it better. So a risk matrix can suffer from something called range compression, and that can result with risks of significantly different values being placed in the same cell. Range compression, just a little bit about that. What's the difference between significant and catastrophic? Well, that range might have been compressed from, say, negligible to minor. The gap between those is not always obvious to people. A risk that is frequent but minor can be the same range as unlikely but catastrophic. So this is really interesting. What we're going to do is just pop back a slide and have a look at that. So frequent but minor. If we look at probability of frequent, that's 5. And the severity of minor, that's 2. That gives us a risk score of 10. But if we then come back here and we say, well, we're looking at the other range of unlikely but catastrophic. Pop back again. Probability of unlikely is 2. Severity of catastrophic is 5. So that also gives us a risk score of 10. Should they be the same? This is really important on how you define that risk matrix. If you're using the standard multiplication, then it's going to give you the same risk score, which is something you really need to think about. Should the severity effectively rank higher? And that's where risk matrix structures can be configured slightly. So the standard multiplication is really good, but occasionally you might need to use a different template to actually account for these anomalies here. Also, something to be aware of is centering bias. And this can result around, in a number of studies, 75% of all probability values being assessed at 2, 3, and 4. And that effectively reduces your 5x5 grid to a 3x3 grid, which reduces that granularity and clarity that we mentioned earlier. Now, don't be afraid of using 2, 3, and 4. If the probability falls around then that's fine. Just be aware that there is that centering bias. And certainly this starts to take place over multiple risk assessments. So it might be that you're using one of the extremes. And as we do more mitigations, those extremes get reduced and we fall into that 2, 3, 4 category. Okay. There's also, as the studies have found, there's also the human nature that we don't want to select the extremes. It's not really minor or really significant catastrophic. We try to avoid those, which in our own mind is trying to do a little risk assessment on this, where I don't want to use this or I don't want to use this because I'm either uncertain that it is a really very low value or that it's a really very high value. So just have that in mind when you're doing this. Another really important aspect is values can be interpreted differently by each person. So everybody on this webinar will know what the word frequent means. But what does it mean to us? What frequent means to me might be different to what it means to somebody else in terms of how often that event happens. So we need to really be clear in our risk management plan and our risk assessment plan here to say what these values represent so that anybody looking at them can see them and go, okay, I understand what frequent means in this context. So that's the important thing there. And those other areas, we mentioned briefly around centering bias, but the anomaly, the outlying areas, the edge areas here, if you will, pay particular attention to those. Again, because low probability, high severity, and higher probability, low severity can provide very similar results. So if you're ever using those extremes, those edge areas, do think about it, whether we need to put something else in place or whether the matrix structure you're using can fairly represent the risk associated with what we're looking at there. But with all that in mind, when now we understand this, we can actually make more use of the risk matrix. So we're just going to go back now and look at what that risk score is, because we mentioned it a few times and we know how we get it. We have the sum of the probability and the severity. Or more simply, this is how risky something is, we've decided. So in our 5x5 matrix structure, you'll typically see risk score of 1 to 2 being very low risk, 3 to 5 low, 6 to 9 medium, 10 to 14 high, 15 plus very high. Just like the probability and severity, the language and the values associated with this, they should all be configurable because this is different. It is somewhat personal to that risk assessment. But this is how we calculate this. Probability severity gives us that number. That number falls into a risk score. Now, that risk score should fall into your risk appetite, your risk acceptance criteria, and so on. So let's have a quick look at that. What is a risk appetite? Well, you might know it as a risk appetite, risk threshold, risk tolerance, risk acceptance criteria, although sometimes that does have a further information associated with it. Basically allows you to set the maximum risk that could be accepted. This could be a value such as 6 or a particular level such as high. You also might say that actually we are risk adverse. We are not going to accept anything that's above low risk based on our risk threshold and appetite here. And this can vary depending on the risk assessment being conducted. So again, it's part of a template structure. You need to be able to configure this. And when used in a risk matrix, it provides that big visual indicator. Oh yes, this is risky, this is not risky. So people should be able to interpret it very simply. And that's one of the other useful things about the risk appetite and the risk matrix. It should be clearly stated whether that risk is acceptable or not, either in the cell, the color, or the number associated with it. Regardless, we should be able to see it. So if my score falls below that risk appetite, am I finished with everything? Well, no. It'd be nice if we were, but we are not. There is the phrase as low as reasonably practicable, ALARP, to consider. And this really comes from health and safety, but it does apply to almost all risk assessments as well. Why do ALARP? Well, we're constantly looking to see if we can reduce that risk further. We shouldn't just accept a risk. We should see if it can be lowered. So we're always aiming for the lowest possible risk here. And it's It's best practice for us. It's in the best interest of everybody we're working with, whether that's colleagues or end users. Say, we always want to try and make that as low as possible. So what are the considerations that need to be going into ALARP? Well, the trouble, or basically the effort to do the mitigation, the time it's going to take to complete that mitigation, and in this day and age, certainly, the money needed for the control. So if we use a very simple financial model here, if the project is going to take 10 people, 2 years to complete, and it's going to cost about £1 million, then it might not be worth implementing at the moment to save us £100,000. We could accept that risk, but we would come back and review it. So we've reduced it as low as reasonably practicable here. It's not practicable for us to reduce that further. It's going to take too long and cost far too much for what that risk reduction is going to be. But we always want to review it, because you never know, in a year's time, there might be new technologies available that allow us to reduce that risk further and start to look at other ways that we can consider those risks. So always come back, always review it. We do have our baseline score if we're doing this, and we know what we're trying to basically better. Quick summary then, because this is a really important concept we want to everybody to look at here. ALARP, as low as reasonably practicable. Reduce the risk as far as you can while being practical to you. So it's not too much trouble, it's not too much time, not too much money, but that's based on the risk you're actually doing. So if it falls within your risk appetite, that's fine, but you should still look to reduce that further. If you can't, then it's always wise to look at whether you actually want to continue with that process or not. You can simply suspend it. So actually, we're not doing this process anymore. It's too risky. We cannot reduce the risk into an acceptable level. And we should continually review our risks and see if we can get it reduced further and further. And we should constantly be looking at trying to reduce that for everybody's sake. Okay, so with all that in mind, how can iPassport risk help? Well, we want to replace those manual processes. So lots of risk assessments are Excel based. That means you've got different workbooks, different worksheets. You might have multiples of these that are all feeding into the one. And that can lead to broken cells or misalignments of information. And it becomes a burdensome process to try and track down where those errors are within there. Also, we don't necessarily always have control over those sheets or version control when they are changed within there. We can't see what those changes were. So this is really important. On a risk assessment, it should be obvious what version of that risk assessment template we are working with. And our risk assessments should change accordingly, but none of the previous ones should. So we should have version control. We should be able to see who made the change, why they made the change as well. We should also have simple templates that anybody using a particular risk assessment can access and use for their particular risk assessment. We shouldn't have to try to find one or ask many people, where's this one? How do we find that? It should all be in one system and easy to access, easy to record, and easy to view for the people that need to look at them. So different templates for different risk assessments that can be managed by different people as well, or an overarching risk manager, for example. There should also be automated reminders. So risk assessments are really important. They're very much like control documents. We should be reviewing them. There should be reminders going out and compulsory reviews, approvals, and authorizations with these. If somebody hasn't done one when we wanted it to, there should be a notification gone out. We should log each of these steps within the system as well, so that we've got a full audit trail. And we should have a centralized system, so everything's stored securely in a cloud environment that we can access quick and simply from anywhere. This is one of the big problems with an Excel sheet or workbook or multiple workbooks. You might not be able to access it when you actually want it, because you might need VPN access in. You might not have been permission into a certain system from a certain location. We need to be able to see a risk assessment when we need to do that assessment and when we need to check it. And risk assessments across a department, an organization, a process even, or a project, we should be able to see those in one place. So we need to be able to search across these to see if we can get trends out of them. And that's another problem with Excel-based ones. They're not necessarily that easy to get those trends pulled out, especially if you can't see risk assessments from other areas. Now, obviously, we do want to restrict access to some of them, but the ones you need to be able to see, you should also be able to trend. And we should be able to put in metrics that automatically trend some of this information for you. How many high-risk ones have we got? How many mitigations have we got outstanding? How far have those mitigations gone along the process? So these are all things that we should be able to see at a glance. Okay, so with all that in mind, what we're going to do is we're just going to leave the presentation area now, and we're actually going to go and have a little look at iPassport and see how we can assist with this, get a hands-on feel for the system and for risk matrices as well. Okay, so here we are in iPassport. I'm just going to log in and I'm going to navigate to the risk assessment module. Okay, so this is the new risk assessment tool within iPassport. I've just come through to the list of assessments. What we're going to do first is actually look at the configuration of the template structure within iPassport, because this is something we've mentioned a lot and something in the risk matrix structure that we need to have a look at, because there are multiple options available to you. As I mentioned, during those concerns around a risk matrix structure, you might have a catastrophic severity that's still only a low risk based on the regular 5x5, you have the ability to also manually configure this. So we're going to have a look at two configurations here. So I've got a manual configuration first, and this is one I've built using a 4x4 grid. Actually, you can see I'm using likelihood here. We'll see probability in the next section. So all of these areas are configurable. The values, the names are adjustable by you. This one has been set up to be a manual system, and what that means is instead of iPassport automatically calculating on a multiplication basis, which is another option which we'll look at in the 5x5, here I have configured it to say, well, unlikely and minor are going to give me a low score of 2 here, occasional and minor 3, but where we differ here is likely and minor. Well, likely and minor is still something I want to take into a bit more care around, so I've given that medium, and you can see here what I've done is medium A, and that's got 4. That's the risk value, so that's the likelihood in this instance, and the severity giving me 4. And then I've got medium A at 5 for frequent but minor. So the same rating, slightly different range here, risk score. But if we move across to say frequent and moderate, well, that's actually high. I've configured it to say high. Whether it's a moderate severity and frequent, that can't be anything but high. It could have been slightly different on the pre-configured structure there. And if you look at likely and moderate, well, I've decided this is still medium to me, but it's a different type of medium. So we have a different color associated with this. And here I've configured it to say medium B. So I have got medium A, medium B, even though the risk score is 5, and we can see medium A is also 5. So this allows me to say, well, actually, I'm not going to find this acceptable. I might find the others acceptable within my appetite or my tolerance, but this is not. And then we'll move down. If we look at significant and occasional, medium B again at 5, and significant but unlikely is medium B, even though the risk score is 4. So I've configured this to say, well, if it's anything is significant, it cannot be less than a medium B, and that's something we want to look at as part of our risk appetite and risk tolerance there. So this is how you can configure this yourself. Now you can also do ranges within these cells, so I don't just have to have low. I could have had low low, and then we could have low medium, medium medium, medium high, high high, and so on and so forth. So you have the ability to configure this with whatever range structure you wish in that manual configuration there, and this gives you much more flexibility. The rest of the system is configured, so I've adjusted the fields to look at what I'm particularly interested in, so the description around the risk, who raised it, the mitigation notes, any acceptance criteria, and the risk decision there, and look at actions and residual risk. So if we were to move ahead with this, it would show me the information based on that manual structure. So the other one I wanted to look at, if I look at configuration here for you, is I've got the standard 5x5 grid. Now these can be extremely useful as well. You don't necessarily have to have manually configured information for everything you're looking at. The standard 5x5 is an extremely useful tool. Here you can see I've given it probability and severity, and again these are all adjustable, configurable by you. You can add additional fields down here. So how I've calculated this one, it is going to be a multiplication, and I've decided there are 5 different levels of risk available here. They've been color coded and the max score has been applied, and I've decided what's acceptable, what's unacceptable based on my risk appetite for this particular one. Doesn't mean we wouldn't look at reducing the risk further if it was in low. There. So here's the matrix as we've configured it here, and you can see a slight difference in that negligible and frequent here is low, minor, frequent here is high at 10. So that's an interesting one that's popped in there. So that's because our medium top is 9. So you've still got a lot of options as to how you configure this based on your maximum score and values around there. And this is the structure that we'll actually be using there. So I've also configured the rest of the fields around here for the description, date raised, existing area, concern, actions, and I've got residual risk here as well. So all of these are configurable, and if I were to edit this, I will be able to show you what that would look like. So if we just go to edit this field here, you'll be able to say I have the ability to add new fields, delete fields, change the labels here. And again, further down, I've got the risk configuration. So I can add new fields. It's very highly configurable for you, which makes it very flexible for different risk assessments. I can pre-populate areas. I can move information around in the order I want it to be presented on screen as well there. So I've got a lot of things I can do. The other important thing here is we have full version history here as well. So I'm in version 2 draft, and we're going to record what we're doing on that particular area as well. So full version history is available within iPassport as we're doing this, which is a vital thing when you come to see, actually my risk assessment has changed, the structure has changed between versions, and why, you'll be able to see why here. Now I can either delete this draft, basically roll it back, leave it as it is while I work on it, or publish it to make it available. As I have made no changes, I'm just going to delete the draft. So what we're going to do is just look at a risk assessment. So if I click onto risk assessment here, we're going to create a new risk assessment. I'm going to use it from configuration, standard 5x5 here. And I'm going to create a fairly simple risk assessment for us to actually follow here. But we're going to do okay. And I'm going to assign myself as the owner here. And we're just going to create that. Okay, so we immediately come into our risk assessment now. So this is where we start to add the risks. And we can have as many risks as we choose on here. So I'm going to add the first risk. Again, these are going to be quite simple ones that we're going to look at. So I'm going to say okay. So we've got our severity level here. So I'm going to select that as moderate, and we've got our probability value, occasional. Now you can see that's going to give us medium, unacceptable risk for us, and that's flagged that up here. That's fine. We're looking at this risk here, and we've decided that that on its own is unacceptable. So if I were to say, what controls have we got? What controls are we going to put in place? Existing controls and mitigations. So we have mitigation, existing controls, notes that we're going to use here. So we're going to just pop in there. We're going to use fairly simple information here. And we're just going to save that. Okay, so that's our risk. We've got the score there. We've added notes. Now what I want to do is just adjust this slightly. So with all of that in mind that we've just got down here, if we were to do a residual risk review here, we're actually going to say, well, what we've got in place doesn't impact the severity here. As it were. So that's still moderate. There's nothing we can do about that in this particular instance. But what we're changing is the probability here of the occurrence. So now we say, well, actually that's improbable. That's going to fall in low for us. So we're actually okay with this. So if we now say save, you can see I can add additional notes if I wish to here. And if I go back to my risks here, we can see this is displaying the initial risk. We can configure this to show the initial risk or the residual risk, depending on what you're actually looking for. And we'll be ultimately able to mark that to say this residual risk is in place. This is what we're doing. But you can see it clearly identifies on the risk matrix here where that risk fell. Now, what we're doing is, because we're doing a wide risk assessment here, not just that one area, we're actually going to do another risk here. So we're just going to pop another one down. And again, it's going to be a fairly generic one. Now, here, chemical spillage is a very broad term. What we would probably be looking to do is say, well, what type of chemical it is. The information here would be available in the safety data sheet supplied with that chemical. So is it a corrosive chemical, for example? Is it a mutagen? That sort of thing. We could look to split that up much further instead of this just generic one. Or we're looking at the volume as well. So again, it's a very generic one, so we're going to use a small one. But here we're going to say actually the severity is significant, depending on what it is. The probability of it happening, we have to sort of decide this, don't we? Well, it's occasional, improbable, unlikely, frequent. We would like to think that the probability is not going to be too severe, so we're going to say it's unlikely. It's unlikely to happen. It does happen, but we know the significance of this when it does. And here you can see that's a medium risk. Over here, that's unacceptable to us as well. So what we would do is we will place some mitigation notes in here just as before. Now again, very generic here, but we're going to say there we go. Something very simple like that. So what we're going to do is look back here and look at that residual risk based on what we've just done. And if we go back here, in this instance, unlike the previous risk, the probability is not going to change. We're just as likely to spill this as before. So we're going to say unlikely. But here, the severity might change because we have containment for this and we have protective equipment available. So we're still not going to be negligible, but we think we're going to be minor, and that's going to put us down into low risk as well. So we can accept that based on our risk appetite. Would we put further mitigations in based on that as low as reasonably practicable? Yes, we should look at those, and that's where we would add those down for residual mitigations. We could assign actions here to actually try and investigate something else that could actually reduce that risk further for us. But if we just pop back now for the time being, we can see we've got two risks in there. They both happen to fall into a different medium. They were both unacceptable to us. We've undertaken that residual risk review based on our mitigation notes, and we can see that they are now acceptable to us. And if we were to click on each individual one of these, it will just give us that information quite clearly while we're looking at those. And you do have the ability to, of course, search for these. So we've got the information there of what we were actually looking at. So laboratory activities, risk score was medium, but our overall residual risk score now is low for the two items we've placed in there. So iPassport gives you the tools to actually identify these, search for these, and indeed export the information out as well. So we've got lots of things we can actually do here. Okay, so thank you everybody for attending. I hope this has been very useful to you, not only in looking at see how risk matrix works and some of the structure and fundamentals behind those, but also how the risk tool within iPassport can assist you in your risk assessments by using that risk matrix. Obviously, if you have any questions or comments, then do please feel free to get in contact with us. You can reach us at support@genialcompliance.com. And here you can ask any questions you wish. If you're interested in the module, then by all means get in contact and our sales team will be able to drop you a little note back. You can also reach them at sales@genialcompliance.com. And obviously you can see my colleague there, Jonathan Douglas. You can reach at jdouglas@genialcompliance.com as well, should you have any further information about that like to discuss. So before I go, I'd like to just mention one of our partner companies. So we are partnered with a wonderful company called Cerden. They provide an absolutely brilliant laboratory information system. If you have any need for a LIMS system, then by all means get in contact with them. They would be more than happy to help. If you're unsure, then please feel free to reach out to us and we can pass the details on. So they provide information around laboratory information management, specifically for pathology. If you have an interest in laboratory information management systems or LIMS for genetics, then by all means get in contact with us. We have a sister company, Genial Genetics, that design and develop a product called iGene, which will certainly meet your needs there. So once again, thank you very much everybody for your time, and do please feel free to get in contact with us.